Welcome back to another Fight Back interview, a video series that dives into the people, the personalities, and the passions that are driving our industry forward. We are delighted to have this episode powered by Mission Omega. Mission Omega was founded in response to the growing need to fight fraud, scams, and other financial and human crime. Omega provides expertise, resources, and support to banks, credit unions, financial services organizations, merchants, and technology companies. They serve as an extension of internal teams responsible for fighting financial crime. And what we love most about them is Mission Omega is a mission-driven fraud services company. And we don't encounter those all the time. So without further ado, let's get after it. All right, welcome to another Fight Back interview. This time we have Allison Miller, who's joining us, and I am delighted to have her on board. I know Allison from being a coach with Fraud Fight Club, but before we jump into all the questions, Allison, can you just do a quick intro?
Sure. So, hey, I'm Allison Miller. My career has been a mix between fraud and cybersecurity, and I've jumped back and forth so many times. I speak both fluently. They are different dialects. There's a lot of those industries have a lot in common, but there's also some differences which I've learned to appreciate and enjoy. And so right now, that's where I'm working. I'm sort of working in the nexus of cybersecurity and fraud, and my experience spans designing, building, and operating these systems that protect people and the platforms that they're using, and understanding that those systems are a combination of people, process, technology, and data. So I've worked with the data, I've worked with the tech, I've worked with the people and the operational processes and such. So it's been a broad view of some interesting places, and I've seen some interesting things on the internet.
Yeah, which is why I thought you would be an interesting person to talk to. I mean, spanning all those different industries, fraud, risk, cyber obviously is relevant in all those. And you've worked for banks, card networks, payment processors, a video game company, I think, and all the way to companies like Google and Reddit. So I guess, did you intentionally want to experience such a variety? And how was this, I assume, helpful when understanding attacks across different industries?
Sure. So the short answer is yes, it was intentional. But the longer answer is I started my career in enterprise cybersecurity, and I couldn't quite figure out where the industry was. So I, opportunistically took job opportunities and learned about that. And one of the opportunistic jumps I took was I was offered an opportunity to work at Visa. And that is a wild place to work early in your career because it's the center of so much. But after spending some time thinking about technology risks and product risks, because I was learning the ins and outs of a payment system and how credit cards work, what I realized is, well, Visa doesn't actually have any risk in this scenario. They're the hub. They are doing analysis, but they're not responsible for chargebacks. And so that began many years of chasing risk. So I left Visa to go to PayPal, which at the time I thought that seemed like one of the riskiest places in town. And then I went to a social network, and then I went to, a startup, and then I went to video games. Seemed like they were really risky. That was the time of gold farming and when MMOs were a really big thing, and casual gaming was also moving money. And then I realized I was starting to not chase risk per se, but complexity and scale and variety of problems. And so, yeah, it's been interesting because, the social network that I was at, for example, they felt that their cybersecurity was a big problem, but what they meant was spam. And what I learned from fighting spam was it was a lot of the same tools that we use in fraud, meaning we're evaluating, for spam, you're evaluating each email message, whereas with fraud, you're evaluating each transaction. And a lot of it is about the reputation of the participants in the interaction, as well as the content. It's easier to understand the content of a payment transaction than maybe the content of an email message. But it's just really interesting how many commonalities there were in these anti-abuse systems, even
Yeah.
though some
Yeah.
of them were mostly content or money moving or things
Yeah.
like that.
No, I hear you. And I started more in the merchant side and then, learning more about banking fraud. And then you go into more like tech platforms like content moderation and trust and safety teams. You see similarities, and obviously there's differences too. There's differences within, financial institutions. You're a big bank, you're a small, credit union, you're a fintech. So
Mm-hmm.
it's, and then there's differences at point in the journey. Is this like transaction monitoring, or is this identity and onboarding? Is this something different? So I think, it does boil down to more cliches, like where it's like it's the people, it's the processes, it's the technology, it's the data, but there's truth to that, and then you have to understand those use cases and pain points and exposure, depending on what company it is, right?
Absolutely. And what I've learned is that abuse shows up in the value proposition of the organization.
Mm,
So banks experience fraud because they're experiencing abuse associated with moving money around, which is part of their value prop. Communications networks experience spam, they experience phishing, things like that, because the element of communication is the value.
yeah.
So abuse flocks to value, if you will.
That's a really good point. And, before going full time about fraud, there was a company I was working for was focusing a lot on fake reviews and fake accounts. And like you look at it initially, it's like, well, fake review, not that big of a deal. But like if it's a review for the type of doctor you want to have or person to watch your kid, it's like, so there's value there. And people abuse
Mm-hmm.
that for good to make them sound better, to make their companies sound better, to potentially hurt their competitors. I'm not sure. There's all kinds of reasons. And that's a really good way to look at it. Like, what core value does this company provide, and how can somebody, usually a human
Manipulate.
brain, manipulate that? Because they will, and they'll find every weakness and hole, and it's not always this just awful, wide scale attack that you just can't really even fathom somebody doing. It's friendly fraud. It's, abuse, promo abuse. It's
Mm-hmm.
doing all kinds of just, more of your gray areas of fraud, I guess.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah. So kind of on that thread, you worked for a couple tech companies, like I mentioned, Google and Reddit. So not specifically them, but when I think of scams, there's always that conversation, definitely within FIs, but in general, how do we help upstream dating apps, social networks, messaging platforms? So, what do you think? And not a silver bullet, obviously, but what do you think companies like that can be doing a little bit better job of?
Sure. So first thing is it requires an ecosystem to bring in like these deep fraud networks and the supply chain of threat actors and such. It's sort of interesting. One of the things that I noticed is that scammers move their victims. And what I mean is when I was dealing with spam attacks at this small social network, one of the things a lot of the spammers do was they would try and move the people they were messaging over to a different app. And so I think that it's kind of like in financial services, we see layering. So layering to cover their tracks within one financial institution. But of course, we're seeing money move between financial institutions, and it's hard for us to track it. And that's why they're doing it. So when looking at scams right now, one of the things that it's stymieing financial institutions is they're just the transaction at the end. The
Sure.
scam has already happened. 80% of the scam has already taken place. And by the time that someone is, in their bank account getting ready to wire or do a Zelle or what have you, they're already tricked. They're committed to the transaction, right? So these notes, these love notes and post-its that we're putting on their experience to say, are you sure? That can't be reversed. They don't even see those anymore. They want to move the money. And it's because there are things that happened upstream. So that's sort of a first observation, that they're being moved around between networks. And even if this starts on, let's say, Instagram or X or what have you, or a dating app, they're being moved into, WhatsApp or some chat app, or a lot of folks are now able to, the scammers are able to trick you just by sending you a text message.
Mhm.
All that
Yeah.
to say, I think that in order to really attack the problem, we want to attack it at its root, which means going upstream. And I think that for communication networks, social platforms, these online platforms and apps, they would be very helpful in adding to their trust and safety budgets to try and get ahead of some of these initial conversations. And I do wonder how we're going to be able to trade information in order to improve our detection capabilities then as the money is about to move. I think that a lot of the conversations that I've been privy to have been around how can we share threat intelligence in order to improve detection and therefore prevent. And I think that it's going to require pressure at multiple points, because just like every type of fraud, it's a balloon. If you squeeze it at onboarding, it gets worse around the point of money movement. If you squeeze it at money movement, they find other places to kind of prioritize the scammy efforts. So I feel like we're going to really have to go after this on multiple fronts. I do think a good note is I do think the social networks do have a vested interest in keeping bots and slop off of their platform, because it actually reduces engagement. It reduces the actual value prop of their platform to the folks who are using it. So I am hoping that what we're gonna see in trust and safety is a shift in emphasis to understanding that this is a new kind of spam and it's very damaging, and that's my hope.
Yeah. And I guess some of it comes down to what people define as slop and what they think is okay just to put out there, and what could potentially be devastating downstream, but they don't have really motivation to do much about that right now. Because, you look at the value props, if they're not, they're in their business, and if they're making X amount of money and they're not bleeding users, like you said, it could hurt the user experience if there's just kind of getting scammed left and right, potentially. And I think that's probably the case, especially for smaller companies that are or mid-sized. But when you get to like huge, massive companies that aren't regulated or losing money, it gets to be interesting as to how much they'll come to the table. And I'm a positive. I'm definitely an optimistic guy, and then I try and think of kind of human nature too, and what where we'll be and what you can control, right? If you work for a bank,
Right.
financial institution, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, and it's a tricky problem. Cybersecurity is ahead of fraud when it comes to threat intel sharing. After many years of trying to systematize the descriptions of things, and I think it's actually harder in trust and safety for two reasons. One is because, don't underplay the privacy implications of these networks actually trying to share this information, and also standardizing on definitions, which is tricky in cybersecurity. And they're talking about, things happening at this layer of the network and this type of malware. That's not necessarily even people interacting per se. So I think it's tricky even if people come to the table properly incentivized.
No, it's a good point.
Yeah. When I was at Google, one of the things I worked on was a program called Safe Browsing, which most folks recognize that because sometimes you'll be trying to go to a link or site and you get a red "don't go there" kind of a page. But Safe Browsing, what we were doing was crawling the internet looking for web pages that were hosting phishing and malware. And we were able then to take that information, share that across the Google products so that, phishing emails that included links to phishing sites were moved to spam immediately versus being delivered into your inbox. And then, of course, there's the browser-based experience folks know about, but that was integrated across all of Google products. It was very helpful for us. And Google Safe Browsing is a publicly available service. But here's the thing. It's not looking for crime sites. It's only looking for malware and phishing. They have to get very specific and very precise because when we decided that something was malicious, then we were sharing that with everyone on the internet in a privacy-preserving way. But we had to be very precise. And so I think when we're talking about sharing information about potential threat actors or their websites or what have you, we have to get really clear. And I'm not sure that we've developed granular enough technical taxonomies to do that yet. But I look forward to that day. And if anyone wants my help on that, I have many ideas. Call me.
There you go. Yeah. And I think it's super interesting, like, because you don't, until you're in someone's role in a different industry, potentially more cyber than fraud or whatever it is, you don't know all the restrictions that they have and what they can and can't do. So sometimes you make assumptions and you're frustrated and you're in FI and these scams are happening at certain places. So of course something needs to change. But keeping those things in mind, the people who are out there on the trust and safety teams are, have those same good intentions as well and are doing good things. And how big are those teams? How much are they invested in?
Right.
What is from the very top? How motivated are they? Okay, we can have that discussion, but it's not. I think it's important to ask questions of them, learn from them, learn from what they're up against, and how they're solving the problem, and what kind of resources they have. Before we just blanketly, and I'm guilty of it too, throw Meta under the bus and just, because there's a lot to unpack on who's at Meta and what they're doing. And I've, when I moved to learn more about trust and safety teams, I got to learn more about what goes into content moderation, and there's loads of good fraud, scam fighters, bad content fighters out there that are kind of really vested in the fight. So that's what encourages me is those people and those people exerting their influence, sharing their ideas, the people on the other side asking questions and having more productive conversations as opposed to, liability. You're making my life at my financial institution living hell with scams, which I get. So.
I think there's a lot to learn just by opening up the conversations. Just like fraud teams are in their own institutions, they're opening up conversations with cyber, and I've always felt we could do more as as anti-fraud folks in connecting with each other. So a lot of what you're doing with About Fraud and Fraud Fight Club, I think, is helpful because the fraud folks just simply aren't as social as the folks in cyber. There's a whole industry of cybersecurity conferences and events where folks exchange techniques and information and such. And so I think opening up the conversation is really great. And without throwing shade at any particular social network, one of because you brought up investment and where those people are and what tools they have, things like that. There's certainly been a trend of reducing investment in trust and safety. And so with the great tech layoffs of the past 18 months or so, a lot of those trust and safety teams have reorganized, at least, and it's not necessarily clear how those problems are being staffed. So I think that that's also something that we as consumers of those products are noticing, actually,
Yeah. No,
as we scroll.
and that's those are open, honest conversations and things we don't like and don't know about, right? Like
Hmm.
we'll do a little bit of that fraud fight club, getting big banks, small banks, fintechs, maybe a social media company or something like that there too. But I think you're right. Having these conversations within our own kind. I work on the onboarding team, and we have this type of fraud. And I work at transaction monitoring, and I'm more of an AML person, but obviously it bleeds into mules and stuff. So it's everybody is only operating from their own vantage point, and what's kind of a pain in the ass for them, which is fair. That's how we operate as humans. So
Yes.
we could go on this forever, but I do want to. What I thought was really cool was. On your LinkedIn, you have a number of speaking engagements, and I figured, you'd been around the block, senior. You've spoken at a number of places, but there's other people, fraud risk professionals, medium, even junior or medium level folks that are kind of coming up and have what a lot of us have, which is imposter syndrome, where we're like, yeah, I want to get out there and talk, but who wants to hear from me? And all those things that kind of swirl in your head when you're first getting out there. So I thought you would be a good person to ask some advice for that, and if they want to lean into kind of getting through that, if you had any tips.
Sure. So the first thing to know about me is I'm a huge introvert. And I get pretty terrible stage fright. But I went to enough cybersecurity events where I was simply talking to people. I was talking to other people at the event, not on stage, just talking to other people at the event, and they were interested in some of the things that I was talking about. And then something happened where I realized that there were people who were on stage who were wrong. I felt they were wrong. And my will, someone is wrong on the internet, that whole thing. So my will to speak grew. At first, I thought I didn't have anything to say, but then I realized, well, I did have some things, actually, just a few small things.
Yeah.
And that kind of snowballed. I actually have spent a lot of my career talking about anti-fraud and anti-abuse to cybersecurity audiences. There's enough in common in the way that we approach detection that just, for me, it's all the same. I mean, it's different, but it's also, there's so much that's similar that I feel like cyber can learn from fraud on a number of dimensions. So that's really what I started talking about. So for folks who are maybe interested in speaking, I think part of the thing is, well, talk to folks, sort of maybe to narrow in what is your story, what is the message that you would bring to one of these events. And then there's some tactical things like, hey, practice talking in front of groups, because the stage fright thing is real. And you can do things like sign up for Toastmasters or, just sort of practice what you would want to be talking about to your computer, maybe even. Practicing is fairly important. And then the third thing I think is, well, consider your audience. Where would you want to speak? I mentioned cybersecurity just has tons of events. So they even have a series of sort of grassroots events called B-sides, security B-sides, like the B-side of a record, for those of you who know vinyl or remember it. And you might have one in your town, and it might be interesting to go there, even though it's not fraud people, even though it's cyber people. They're usually pretty welcoming. You can get a vibe of it, and maybe you find that actually there is something that you want to talk about in that context. There's also some areas have a large enough fraud fighter population that they might have meetups. So those smaller events are a good place to practice. But understand who's in your audience, because if you're speaking to a corporate audience, or like if you're speaking to a bunch of vendors, it's different than if you're speaking to a bunch of banks. And so I think just doing a little bit of work to match your message to who you're trying to communicate it to, or pick your event because that's who you want to be sharing your message with. I think those are some things to keep in mind. And then the last thing is, if there's a speaker that you admire, if there's someone who, you've enjoyed listening to them talk, ask them. So I know some folks in sort of in my sort of ecosystem that they have gotten professional training, or they've not got professional training, but they have a very particular way of practicing. And some of those people may be willing to give you feedback on your outlines. I am also on the selection track or the selection board for an editorial board, essentially, of multiple conferences, and asking those folks what they're looking for when they select talks from a group of proposals. Those are all things just sort of, game the system a little bit, or just get a little context.
I love it. Well, first off, so many practical steps there, which is great. But even the first thing you said, which is just kind of taking a step back and looking at when people are on stages, it doesn't mean they're the smartest, most right kind of, knowledgeable people in the world. And that's not to diminish people who are on stages. I've been on them. And it's just it's a platform, right? And they've worked hard to learn, usually very experienced over their years, and they're going to make some certain points. And but they took the shot, or were given maybe an opportunity to go and do it, and they did it, and then they did it again, and it got easier over time. Some are
Yes.
maybe more naturally, introvert, extrovert, anxiety, no anxiety, but to your point, even the calmest of all calm people are going to get a little butterflies right before they go up. All the way to like, man, that is the worst. That's a really scary thought for me. But I think everywhere from one end to the other, you can do it, and you can find how to lean into it a little bit more and lean into that uncomfortableness. I think one way is just to kind of don't bring down the people you see, but don't be scared of that's like some unattainable thing. Like it's
Definitely not.
in a lot
I
of cases
mean,
it's not, right?
those folks all had their first time on stage too.
Yeah.
And the people who got it wrong, in my opinion, part of what that was once they're on stage, folks seem to think they knew everything about everything.
Yeah.
So,
and people who tend to kind of be a bit more, I don't know if I want to go speak, are less like that. You want to hear more from those people who are, some people like to get on stage and be very confident, and this is how I see everything, and
they're
and I don't want
performers. They love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, it's just there's different personalities. I think that's important. I think you hit on it there. Like when you hear a panel speak, yeah, you'll have people who are just very demonstrative, but I think just own who you are up there. If you're a person who's shorter on words, I'm jealous of those people, because I'm like, I would like to use less words. But like, it's just own who you are. If you're believing in your message and you're driven by maybe like, hey, that's not exactly how I feel, put it out there. And I think most people are not analyzing too much of your style and all of that. They connect with it, that it's authentic, that you're passionate about it. And of course, that they think it's a good point or a bad point. But even if it's a bad point, it creates an interesting dialogue. And if you're open to then getting the feedback of, what, I feel this way, that's great. And I think we need more, frankly, of people disagreeing on stage. Ian Mitchell talks about it sometimes. And, you got to do it in a productive way. But like, if we're all just saying everybody is doing the great thing, and, then we're maybe not learning as much as we could. So
I'm kind of famous for that.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is maybe why it came up, not intentionally, but why it came up. And I think, of course, people are like, oh, you don't want to have too much, controversy, but it's in a healthy way, right? Like it's like if you're like arguing with your family or your best friend, it's like, we're all trying to do something. I feel differently. You feel differently. Fine. Let's have a productive conversation about why we both don't agree on this. And that actually, for me, as a person who hates conflict, my wife and I talk about this. It's like, she's like, we got to settle this thing. So like, sometimes it's just looking at yourself and being like, hey, we got to lean into things to feel a little uncomfortable. It's going to feel uncomfortable for a little bit. But in the end, you might learn more. At the very
Yeah.
least, it's a more interesting conversation to hear from. Like it's, like you hear people
Yes.
and you don't think bad about the person you potentially didn't disagree with. You're just like, that's not how I saw it, but I get why they see it. That's just not how I see it, right?
Yeah, I just feel like when there's some differences of opinion, there's more opportunity to learn.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, we're all making this up as we go along.
We're trying
For
to
some
figure
of
this
the
shit
things that we're
out.
doing, like, there's no one right answer. And so just adding a little bit more information, a different vantage point into the mix is helpful. I mean, I guess that's part of why my career has gone the way that I've gone. A tech company to financial service company to tech company, working in
Yeah.
cyber and then in product. And I like to look at things from a different perspective and be challenged, because then I think we can make whole systems better. So
Yes. Yeah, I'm shamelessly going to work the Eagles in, although
do it.
I didn't explain. I normally wear my Fraud Fight Club stuff. The Eagles won the Super Bowl yesterday, so I was like, this is a justified
Go
reason to
birds.
be in my zone. Go Birds. But Jalen Hurts, their MVP, he's been through a lot of adversity, and he was like, you either win or you learn. And like,
Oh, that's
not that
beautiful.
like not that you're losing if you make a bad point, but I think people want to not be looked at as I didn't know the thing and somebody else proved me wrong and stuff like that. But like, yeah, on a stage, it might be a harder learning environment, but put yourself out there. And if you believe in your point, make your point. Or if you really don't agree with the other person, do it in a respectful way. And if they challenge you and then they kind of disprove something that you say, okay, then you learned, right? And is there somebody that's looking at you like, oh, that guy got handed it, but like, no, like you're learning. And if you're nervous about speaking on stage, feel free to do this behind the scenes. All the we've gone to the most terrifying things for people to speak about, but I think especially more experienced speakers, I like the ones where they're willing to give their opinion, they're willing to do it respectfully, and I do think those conversations will help us move forward. So, all right, so we're taking a little longer than normal, but all good. This is great. This is great conversation. So, Allison, we talked before. I was like, yeah, don't want to go to over this amount of time. We blew that out of the water. That's all good. So let's a couple more questions. We all know the efficiencies, I would say, from cyber and fraud teams sharing. I hear fusion left, right, and sideways. Data, tech, strategy, right? I think everyone agrees. Yeah, we should be fusing or in some capacity sharing. But like, what are you seeing operationalized? And this is just a genuine question from somebody who's not as close to it. Like, do you see more fusion centers being stood up? Or at the very least, do you see more action being taken and actually being put into production? These sharing elements.
Yeah. I'm not working with anyone who has a fusion center per se
Yeah.
right now. I have worked in fusion center environments. Um and the environments that I worked in that had fusion centers I thought it was interesting, but I didn't see a ton of tool integration. They were sitting together all in the room, so there was some opportunity for cross training and discussion, and maybe someone could cover for someone else on a who was working normally on a slightly different thing, but it wasn't kind of the vision that I've heard a lot of banks put out. Here's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing in smaller organizations that don't have a fraud team, which is usually not a financial services company per se, but maybe like a retailer or someone providing online services. Someone realizes, oh, we have a fraud problem, or, oh, we have a problem with ATO,
Yeah.
which in many ways, because it involves customers, it feels like anti-abuse or fraud.
Mhm.
And they hand that problem to the CISO, the head of cybersecurity, because it's kind of the closest risk-minded executive. And so those folks are building Fusion because they're using cyber leadership and cyber teams to build out their fraud program. So they have this flavor of cyber because that's kind of the mindset and where they start. That's one set of things that I'm seeing. And then on the other side, this is more with like banks. So banks are looking at the investment they make in cyber, which is usually pretty significant for banks, and then the investment they're making in fraud, and they're saying, aren't these really similar? Can't we, or they notice, okay, this is a generalization, so forgive me, y'all, but what I've observed is that cyber teams tend to be more tech forward. They buy a lot of tech, and they in a lot of cases are operating their own tech, where fraud is a little bit more data forward, meaning they have analytics teams, they have folks who are actually, digging into the data to find the trends and do things. But cyber is more tech forward and fraud is more data forward. And those specialties make it kind of hard for them to talk in the sense that cyber will send data over to fraud, but it's not necessarily in a format that the fraud folks can use. And it's not necessarily something they're like, okay, this is a bunch of IP addresses that you found malware on. Why are you sending it to me? Or what, things like that. And then the technology that cyber has, when they look over at fraud and they see the workflow systems a lot of us are on, when they see the weird duct tape together tooling that's come together, and they have no idea how payments, this is a super generalized, a lot of them don't actually understand like the intricacies of how the money moves because it's too deep in the stack. Like they're securing networks, they're encrypting data, they have thoughts on IAM, identity and access management, so they have thoughts on login, and they have thoughts on all this perimeter security stuff and how to detect if something bad is happening with someone who works inside the bank, but they don't know what's happening in the money movement itself. So there's this, can you use this tool? Can you use that tool? And a lot of that is being sorted out. Okay, so that was a long way of like how they are trying to fuse. They're trying to fuse, but they haven't quite fused yet. And here's what I see. I see that a lot of the technologies that have historically been sold into fraud departments, they're starting to talk more, it's been a bajillion years since we've been talking about ML in fraud tools. But now, of course, they're talking about AI in the fraud tools. Great. And additional automation and orchestration between all of these systems. And they're starting to use language that is also used in cyber. And then over on the perimeter, where cyber in the past had been, preventing attacks against a website, these perimeter technologies are also bot detection, account risk, trying to protect login. So you see, what I see is that there are certain places in the, cyber through fraud lifecycle and system set where there's a couple of more places where there's more overlap and where they're both essentially trying to solve the same problem. So an example is cyber teams are trying to solve credential stuffing. And I kept hearing that. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like you're talking about ATO, right? Like, we if you've worked on ATO for more than a month, you sort of, yes, that is one of the things that someone can do to take over an account. And they're like, oh, we got to attack this credential stuffing problem. Okay. But together, they both want to prevent upstream things that could assist with an ATO. And the fraud team wants to prevent, if an ATO has happened, they want to prevent the downstream damage. So here, finally, there are like overlaps that actually they're trying to solve the same problem. And that's really cool. And that's where I see teams connecting and working together. And so I think that I sort of describe that as tech fusion. So fusion centers, I think lots of folks have tried it and they've had, some have had great success. Some have like, I don't know if this is working. But what I see now is collaboration in the tech. And I think that that's going to be a little more sustainable because folks are then they're talking about the same thing. They're talking about solving the same problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, even getting away from just a fusion term, because I think we get caught up in that a lot. And then it's like, what differences do you have? What are the barriers? Like, I look at tech this way, you look at data this way, you're using it and it just doesn't, there's a lot of there's a lot of barriers that you have to overcome, because these are teams that have, been brought up in different worlds. So kind of aligning them and then, taking it step by step, because I think, yes, we recognize the efficiencies, but it's not like you just plug these things together. There's
Right.
a number of things you outlined that make that more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're an enormous bank and you've done it the same way forever, right? Like that can take a while, but it's good to see there's opportunities.
Definitely.
And yeah, I guess whatever we're calling a fusion or otherwise, it's really just collaborating and finding ways to actually understand what the other team is using, and syncing that with your people, processes, and technology. So we'll get you out of here on a question I ask all of our guests. So we were intentional with naming the interview series Fight Back, and because job's hard, cyber fraud risk, wherever you are, you're getting told you're letting too much fraud through, or breaches, and then you're upsetting good customers if you're doing it too strict or in other ways. So why, or what keeps you fighting back?
Yeah. So I think, if you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said something like, I've got a protective instinct, which I think is true. And I'm a technologist, right? Like I am fascinated. I chased risk. Now I've been chasing kind of complexity. There continue to be a variety of problems, so it never gets boring. But sort of on the protecting tip, I think that it's just not fair. Like, I just feel indignant about some of the things that I'm like some of the scams that have become so pervasive, and these situations. I feel like it's just not fair. And I mentioned I'm a technologist. Like, I love innovation. The way that we continue to innovate with these technologies and bring great value to the world through financial services and social connection and proliferation of information. If we're going to innovate, there has to be some kind of baseline, if not safety, of at least kind of transparency and fairness. And so some of these scams I'm hearing about, they just make me mad, man.
Yeah,
So
that's
that's what keeps me fighting. Like, we got to keep fighting. The folks who understand how to assist, I think, need to keep fighting in order for us to really, to get the full value out of these systems that we are building.
Yeah, I think you cut to like the purpose of it. Like, yeah, a job is hard, and you give more effort if you want to make more money, whatever it is. And so people keep fighting back so they can have a good career. But then it's like, what's deeper than that, other than why everybody has a career? Because you need to. There's a purpose behind it, and it's just like, some of the stuff is just so fucked up. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say that, but
You're not.
yeah, is YouTube gonna get mad at me for that? We'll worry about
No,
that
you'll be fine. You just
Yeah,
you
there
just
you
need to mark it as not for kids.
go. See, the things I'm learning live during a podcast, but it's just like you said, it's not fair. It's like,
It's not fair. It's
this
not
shouldn't
cool.
be happening. And I think when you get to a point deep enough, you're a technologist, you're working operations, you're a solution provider, you're a bank, you're an analyst, you're an exec. Like, you get to a point where you're like, I know enough. I'm passionate about building my career and advancing, but I just want to make a difference, because I know how unfair this stuff is. Where
Yeah.
before I worked in this industry, I had no idea. I had credit card fraud, but like the scams, like, and I think that's probably part of the problem. I don't think people really understand the level of impact when you get into some of these things. It's not just just
Well,
fraud on my credit card. So.
I worked in credit card for a long time. So it was all about balancing incentives, right? And so, between the issuer and the acquirer, the issuer and the merchant, we're going to figure out who is liable. And it just kind of like goes that way. Hooray for Reg E and Reg Z in the US. But scams have a very human cost. And there are some other abuse vectors that we don't have to deal with in fraud per se, but there are other abuse vectors that have a very real human cost.
Yeah. That's it, right? And it's outside of AML and laundering and human trafficking and fraud that fuels that. And there's just,
yeah.
Go ahead. Look like you were going to say something.
Oh, I was going to say, well, it's so the new scams, they aren't that far from human trafficking, right?
Yeah, no, and I think you handle certain things in whatever fraud department you're in. You're kind of siloed. You have your use case, or but it's just actually more expanding outside of that and seeing how all this stuff kind of ties together and it just not being fair, and then how can you make an impact? Can you work for can you work as a CISO as you were at one point? Can you be a head of fraud? Can you found a network of fraud fighters in this whole About Fraud Fight Club thing, which I never saw coming. So, but I think if you're driven from that, that whole fighting back from a bit more genuine of a purpose and staying realistic, like it's a job too. And, but you can do both. Right. And I think it's a great career to build a purpose-driven career in, because there's such a connection with like the end problem. And it makes I would think it makes yours, other people's days, not always easy, but interesting and different. And, it keeps our minds and all the people that really get into it. They seem to love that challenge of how the hell can we make it less not fair? Cool. Well, that's it. We blew past the time, like I said, but this is great. And anytime we can have interesting conversation, I am down to go longer.
Thanks, PJ.
Thank you, Allison, so much for joining.